Dear participants, we are glad to see all of you. Today we have a great discussion. Our research fellow, Paolo Pizzolo from Italy. Now he is research fellow at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies. And today he presents his article with a great topic on China's military potential naval build-up through the geopolitical perspective. We also have our great discussant, Igor Prohin, also a research fellow at the Center for Comprehensive European International Studies, who is China's observer for a long period of time. And we also hope that participants will ask questions. You are absolutely welcome to do it. Please write your questions in the chat or raise your hand and ask them in voice. So now I don't want to more steal time from our great discussions. Please, Paola, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Veronica. First of all, I would like to thank all the Center for Comprehensive European International Studies for organizing this scientific seminar. So basically today I will present a research article to you that has been published in September, so 2 months ago, in the Italian Political Science Review. And it's a research article on China's naval buildup, so China maritime strategy, and specifically a comparison of it with pre-World War I Imperial Germany maritime strategy. I think that the best thing to do is to share my screen for the slides so that you can follow better. But I'm disabled of screen sharing. I don't know, should I continue without slides?
Please wait a minute. Alexander will help us. Please wait a second. Alexander will help us to share your screen. Now you can do it.
Okay, thank you. All right. So can you see?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so the title of the paper is The Legacy of Admiral von Tirpitz, a Geopolitical Understanding of China's Naval Buildup Through Sea Denial Strategies. So first of all, I will give you a general overlook of the structure of the research article with the abstract of the main points that will be analyzed. Well, first of all, we know that China is can be considered now, let's say officially, a manifest challenger of the US-led international order. By US-led international order, of course, we refer to that unipolar world system that emerged after the Cold War, and basically the demise of the Soviet Union as counterbalance of that unipolarism. Since then, let's say the US had a moment of unipolar hegemony that after, let's say, 10 years, but also for sure after 20 years, is being questioned by several international actors and phenomena. One of these is, of course, China's revisionist strategy. The revisionist strategy of China has included many spheres, not only the infrastructural field, but also the economic field, and what is important for our article, the military field, specifically the naval military buildup. Now, we know that throughout history, revisionist and challenging powers that want to overcome the status quo tend to defy the established order through armed races. We will see this more in detail, how it happens and who were the actors that did this as case studies. And within this frame, we introduced in the article two main theoretical approaches that come from classical geopolitics. On one hand, the theory that comes from Admiral Mahan on global maritime hegemony, and on the other one, this idea of regional counterbalance theory based on risk analysis by Admiral Tirpitz. We will compare in this article these two theories and try to see why China is not developing a global maritime strategy as the one envisioned by Admiral Mahan, but instead, and this is the argument of the paper, it's pursuing a Tirpitzian regional approach, which is focused on counterbalancing the US presence in the Pacific through some specific tactics that are known as anti-access and area denial strategies. We will see what these mean. So basically, the paper compares, after this theoretical frame, in a diachronical way, Chinese naval arm race with the one pursued by Imperial Germany's before World War I. That led ultimately to the outbreak of the war. Let's say that after trying to show that China is pursuing a similar strategy, the article then tries to draw some conclusions by saying that probably if China will continue the strategy, it could foster a regional arm race and could also start some regional security dilemmas that could lead eventually to maybe a local conflict. Okay, so let's see. First of all, we have to understand why China is pursuing a military strategy. We have to understand this from the history of China of the past centuries, 2 centuries. We have to understand that China went through an extremely humiliating historical era, the so-called century of humiliation, that can be dated between the mid of the 19th century to the second half of the 20th century. This century of humiliation was characterized by foreign intervention, because we may remember that the imperial and colonial powers of the time, especially European, but not only, tried to get some portions of territory and some concessions from China, commercial concessions, that led to a loss of sovereignty of China in several areas. Also, after, for instance, the Opium Wars won by Great Britain, China had to accept the opening of the market of opium from India to China at the, let's say, at the negotiation that Britain imposed, and also the concession of depots and trade spots, like, for instance, Hong Kong, and so on. Same thing applies for Portugal, Germany. All of these countries got some small portions of Chinese land from which they could pursue their trade policies. But then, of course, there was also not only this as a breakup, but also the Japanese gradual expansion, rise as a power, as a maritime power, as an imperial power, which also gradually took away from China portions of territory. Let's think, for instance, at the first Sino-Japanese war that led to the loss of Taiwan, that after the Treaty of Shimonoseki went to Japan. And again, gradually, Japan got away from the Chinese-influenced Korea, the Korean peninsula. And finally, of course, since 1931, Japan invaded the Chinese territory, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo, as we know, and then also continuing its invasion in the Chinese mainland and heartland of the Chinese territory. All this humiliation stopped after the end of World War II, the defeat of the Japanese, and also the end of the civil war between nationalist forces and communist forces that led, of course, to the victory of Mao Zedong and the creation of the People's Republic of China. From then on, China could become sovereign again, although if we want to analyze its rise, we have to, of course, consider Deng Xiaoping's era and its economic reforms. But it's not until the early 2000s that we can say that China can be considered a great power. Today, data says that China is the second greatest world power. It has the second economy, according to the World Bank. In some cases, some analysts believe that it's the first economy already, if we analyze some parameters. And also it has the largest military of the world, at least in terms of numbers, not of technology, but of numerical capacity. We said that it can be considered a revisionist power, and its revisionist strategy affects economic, infrastructural, cultural, diplomatic, and military domain. And the aim of the Chinese revisionist strategy is basically to create an international system that could be either bipolar or multipolar, but in any case, the aim would be to overcome the post-Cold War unipolarism led by the United States. Some tools through which China is pursuing this revisionist strategy, economic and infrastructural, are, for instance, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, through which it should finance and develop the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the New Development Bank of the BRICS, as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that has been signed in the Pacific region, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, and also, interestingly, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is considered by some analysts as a kind of counter-alter of NATO in terms of defense and security for the East. Of course, the SCO is a very extremely important organization that has really an Asian and Eurasian scope, because of course it includes not only China, but Russia, India, Pakistan, as well as now, for instance, Iran is an acceding member. So it's an incredibly important organization for this revisionist strategy. And also this idea that China is a revisionist power has been enshrined by the official documents of the United States, of the White House. For instance, the security strategy, the national security strategy of the US of 2017 under Trump considered China officially as a revisionist. And again, the interim national security strategic guidance of 2021 under Biden administration considered China a more assertive power and probably the chief challenge to the United States. One of the challenges comes from naval buildup, of course, one of many. And as we already said, history teaches that often great power become great powers after naval buildups. This has been the case, for instance, in modern history for Spain, for Portugal, for Holland, this between, of course, the 16th and 17th century, for France and England in the 18th century, for England definitely in the 19th century, and then, of course, also for those countries that were latecomers or challengers, like, for instance, Russia, Germany, the US, and also Japan. All of them at a certain point implemented naval buildup. Let's consider a little bit the literature, a literature review on the explanations for China's naval buildup, because the IR scholarly debate suggests different hypotheses, trying to explain why China is pursuing a naval arm race. First of all, there is a constructivist interpretation that says that China is doing that because it wants to be recognized as a major world power. And so it's a matter of identity, of a recognition of power identity. In this sense, China is pursuing this military strategy to really be considered by the rest of the international community as a great power. In other words, a great power cannot stay without a fleet, and a very important military fleet. Then there is the idea that, which is similar to the previous, that the naval expansion of China is driven by the pursuit of prestige, power, and glory. And this would be led by the idea of overcoming, once again, the century of humiliation trauma. In other words, China says, if I have a strong navy, nobody will ever dare to inflict me again a humiliation. nor the Western powers, nor Japan, nor any other. Then there is another interpretation that comes from realism. For instance, offensive realism believes that the naval programs reflect simply a power maximizing foreign policy that wants to augment in absolute terms the relative power of China. In other words, by incrementing this naval policy, China is increasing its power and reducing automatically the power of other actors in a trade-off, because if I increase my power, automatically the power of others is decreased. And so I gain perhaps a local hegemony. Instead, the defense realism explains this naval buildup more through the lenses of offense-defense balance. So creating a kind of balance of power in order to avoid and prevent other countries to potentially threaten China. China creates a balance, an equilibrium, especially in the South China Sea and East China Sea. And so this equilibrium avoids the war, the outbreak of a potential war. It also is a consequence of the so-called security dilemma trap. In other words, while I don't trust my neighbors, since I don't trust my neighbors, I start a naval buildup that I use as a deterrent, although my neighbors could interpret it as an aggressive intention. And this, of course, follows the idea of Thucydides' trap and the idea that the mistrust of neighbors could create an arms race that could potentially lead to war. This is what had happened in the Peloponnesian War, according to Thucydides. But it could also create a balance. A neoliberalism perspective instead highlights the cooperative aspect, saying that China is not pursuing any form of aggression through a naval military buildup, but it wants only to coordinate its economic and political objectives. It's just an instrument that is serving the purpose of incrementing Chinese economic projects, including the Belt and Road Initiative. Then there is the interpretation that highlights the domestic political factors. In other words, China's naval construction helps the interest of heavy industry and shipbuilding companies that profit from this market and from this strategy. Another interpretation, which I believe is really suggestive, is the so-called idea of naval nationalism. In other words, China manifests nationalist prestige strategy through a naval buildup, and this is aimed to achieve a greater domestic legitimacy. In other words, the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, would have more consensus, inner consensus, through this prestige strategy. Another suggestive idea instead is the one of naval diplomacy. In other words, this strategy is aimed at settling international disputes, but also upholding China's national interests through the pressure that can be given by the fleet. In other words, for instance, it would be easier to implement the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, that is the sea branch of the Belt and Road Initiative, through the coercion that can be exercised even indirectly by a strong fleet. And this is similar somewhat to the so-called gunboat diplomacy that was typical of European powers in the 19th and early 20th century, when they wanted to open, for instance, ports and trade depots through, let's say, the threatening of the fleet. This is, for instance, what the US had done vis-a-vis Japan, to open Japanese commerce. Finally, there is also a literature that stresses how revisionist powers tend to utilize that scheme that comes from the power transition theory, according to which when we have a power transition in an area, in a regional scenario, this occurs also with military power shifts. And so in this sense, China's naval buildup would be an example of power transition, clearly to overcome the US or the US allies' status quo and hegemony in the Pacific. Okay, let's move on to the theoretical frame now, and let's introduce a little bit some concepts that are dear to maritime geopolitics. First of all, we have to understand that one of the main assumptions of classical geopolitics from its beginning is the idea that basically history can be described as a continual struggle between sea powers and land powers. This is an assumption that comes in Mackinder works, but also in Schmidt's works, and so on. All classical geopoliticians stress this importance of continental versus sea powers. And specifically, the Anglo-Saxon school of geopolitics stresses, especially in Mahan's theorization, the supremacy of sea power over continental power for world hegemony. In other words, according to this idea, sea power would guarantee world hegemony. And another idea that comes from this school is that a land power that could emerge from a continental scenario could put at stake the world hegemony of the sea powers, creating a continental might that could put into stake, let's say, sea lanes and sea international connections. This was something that Mackinder highlighted, especially when Mackinder wrote this idea in the first half of the 20th century, especially in some famous works like the Geographical Pivot of History of 1904, and also Democratic Ideals and Reality, 1919. He stressed the importance, for instance, of the heartland and of the Eurasian continental landmass for the purpose of world hegemony, because Mackinder believed if a continental power could unify this supercontinent, the Eurasian supercontinent, then it would put at stake the world hegemony of a sea power, thus creating a superpower. And if it would combine sea power with land power, then it would acquire inevitably world hegemony. But this is something that maybe we will talk about another time more in detail. What we have to understand here is that for our paper, there are two maritime visions and theories of world hegemony, or at least of maritime power. One is the one that was created by Admiral Mahan. We can see him on the left. And the other one is the regional interpretation created by Admiral Tirpitz on the right. So let's consider these two visions. First of all, Mahan theorized the so-called global hegemonic naval theory. Especially this theory was introduced in his fundamental work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. He created a connection between international relations and naval power in order to achieve world power status. Basically, what did he do? Mahan analyzed thoroughly the rise of the British Navy, the Navy of the British Empire, and believed that if a country pursued the same strategy of the British Empire, of the Royal Navy, it would have acquired world hegemony through control of the sea. Of course, he was speaking for the United States because he was an American admiral and he was looking from the lenses of his national interest. And he was basically trying to say, if we copy the Brits, we will get a similar result, world hegemony through the control of sea lanes. But how could this be achieved, this control of the world's oceans? Well, basically through controlling some overseas bases, colonies, and depots that would operate globally, and also through the possession of a mighty battle fleet. In other words, we can see that the British Empire gained the control of the world's oceans through a connection of specific strategic points that would allow this unstopped chain of communication. For instance, a strategic spot in South America, like British Guyana, another strategic one in South Africa, and in other places in Africa. Then, of course, the strategic position in India, Australia and Oceania, and so forth. All this connection created a network of power that guaranteed global hegemony through the ocean, through the possession of sea lanes. Mahan believed that the US should do basically the same through the control of strategic water lanes and geographic positions, like, for instance, the Panama Strait, the Panama Canal. And also, of course, through the control of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And this actually occurred after the Hispano-American War of 1898, after which the US could control the Caribbean basin on one hand with the control on Cuba, and on the other hand, the Pacific one with the control on the Philippines. This created two barriers that were the first line of defense for the United States. And the other thing that it did was securing internal borders. In other words, the United States could exert and project maritime power because they had secured their internal borders. First, through the Monroe Doctrine, avoiding other interferences in the American continents, especially from Europe, and then creating good neighborhood with Canada and Mexico, Pan-American institution, and so on. After doing that, it could project world power and sea power. This was augmented even more after World War I with Wilsonism and so on. But this is what Mahan observed. It was much easier to powers to exert this kind of international projection only when they had secured internal borders and not, let's say, neighboring countries that could have created hostility or rivalry. In other words, for instance, the United States and the United Kingdom had secured borders, internal borders, and so they were successful in this sense to project maritime power. Other countries like France, Germany, or Russia, and in this case even China today, are less successful because they have to face problems with their borders, their internal borders. France historically had only the secured border with Great Britain through the Channel, and with Spain through the Pyrenees, and with Italy through the Alps, but it always had the problem with Germany in the east of France. Germany had problems in the west and in the east without having secure borders. Russia, the same, it had problems basically with all its borders, except for maybe the north one, the Arctic one, which basically gained, let's say, inaccessibility at least in the winter. It froze. Instead, US and UK could exert this power because they didn't have to counter this kind of problems. So basically, to sum up, Mahan believed in sea control strategy for international hegemony, maritime hegemony. On the other hand, we have Tirpitz's anti-hegemonic risk theory. Let's just remember a little bit who was Tirpitz. Basically, Tirpitz was the admiral that was appointed by the Kaiser Wilhelm II before World War I as the developer of the Imperial German fleet, military fleet. Before then, we may remember that Chancellor Bismarck didn't want to have a significant fleet, didn't want to have colonies, didn't want to have an international projection. It just focused on trying to maintain a balance in Europe through its system of alliances and counter-alliances and security and counter-security. Instead, when Kaiser Wilhelm becomes monarch, Bismarck is sent away, he appoints other chancellors, and these chancellors and him start Weltpolitik, so world politics, based on the idea of challenging the hegemon of the time, which was, of course, Great Britain, challenging this hegemon in the sea with the construction of a fleet, and also pursuing a colonist strategy, trying to get colonies. And in this sense, we have this Tirpitz plan for the construction of the German fleet. First of all, this was a defensive reaction that is typical of newly rising states, of challengers, latecomers, if we want. And it's based on the idea to counterbalance at a regional level the hegemon. Not to replace the hegemon, because it wouldn't have been possible nor desirable. Germany knew that it could, first of all, not replace the UK as a maritime power. It didn't have the resources. And then it didn't even need to do that because it didn't have this kind of world projection that went from the Americas, from Canada to Australia. It didn't need that. But it needed to counterbalance at a regional level the hegemon. And this idea of counterbalance is based on the principles of deterrence and risk theory. In other words, what did Germany do? It created this kind of fleet that was based and placed in the North Sea, pointing at Great Britain, like a barrier pointing at Great Britain. And it was like a gun pointed at Great Britain. It didn't shoot, but it was always pointed. And it compelled Great Britain to do what? To take a risk. Because if Great Britain attacked this so-called Risikoflot, this risk fleet, it would, first of all, have to redeploy parts of its fleet that were in other scenarios of the world in the North Sea. And secondly, it had to face severe damage, because even if it destroyed eventually the German fleet, this would have been through severe casualties. And these casualties would probably make the Royal Navy much weaker, to the advantage of other powers like, I don't know, the US or Japan, for instance. And so basically, through deterrence, Germany understood that Britain could not have the intention to attack Germany. And also the idea was to create the sea denial tactic. In other words, the access to the North Sea was precluded to Great Britain, with, of course, damage to its economic interest, especially to the Strait, to the Baltic area, and so on. And the one thing that it's important to understand is what was the result, the outcome of this strategy of Germany. Was this strategy a success, or was it a failure? Well, basically, it led to an arms race, because Great Britain did not attack Germany, the German fleet at that moment, but it created more and more and more ships. And Germany responded with the creation of more and more and more ships. And eventually even more sophisticated ships, like, for instance, the Dreadnought by the UK. And so what, in the end, this arms race led to such a build-up of military might that eventually led also to war, due to the security dilemma. And this was one of the reasons why World War I broke out, the military build-up of Germany. So it was a failure. Tirpitz strategy was a failure. But now enough with this historical background, and let's consider now China in the light of this Tirpitzian strategy. The article wants to highlight some aspects that make Chinese maritime strategy similar to Imperial Germany I. Let's see exactly how. Well, first of all, China is building not a full-fledged navy that could counter or replace the hegemony of the US in the world. Clearly not. Why? Because like Germany, first of all, it doesn't have the resources, and then it doesn't have the intention. China doesn't need a global navy of the same level of the US. In other words, it's creating a regional navy with limited force projection capabilities. And similarly to Tirpitz fleet, China also relies on A2AD capabilities. In other words, anti-access and area denial capabilities, which are basically focused on maritime denial and not maritime control. Specifically, anti-access capabilities are those tools like satellite and missile technology that prevent a rival from entering a theater of operation, in this case, the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And instead, area denial operations include air defense capabilities, mines, submarines, and missiles to prevent the freedom of action of an area that is under an enemy's control. In other words, the US fleet cannot move as it wants in an area that it has mines, submarines, and so on. Also, this idea of A2AD capabilities includes non-kinetic threats, like, for instance, cyber warfare. Cyber warfare, an interruption of communication, of IT communication, that could impede, for instance, two rival marine forces to coordinate themselves. And specifically, there are three main naval assets that China is fostering in this respect. First of all, quiet submarine forces. It's pointing a lot in submarines. And submarines are really the best example of anti-access denial strategies. Then also anti-ship missiles and specific anti-ship missiles designed to counter aircraft carriers. However, apart from that, China is also producing aircraft carriers. Now it has two already full-fledged ones that are fully operating. One is soon will be completed, and there are plans that maybe in the next decade it could reach 12, which is really a lot. And some would say, well, but why creating aircraft carriers that would maybe represent more a Mahanian perspective on global control, because they project power globally? Well, actually, this is not necessarily true, because aircraft carriers can also be utilized only in a regional understanding, especially as deterrents, and also to avoid the encirclement of the so-called First Island chain. And talking about the First Island chain, we know that there are two strategic lines of defense of China. The first one is the second island chain, which is really far from the Chinese territory, and the second one is the first island chain, which is really crucial for Chinese national interest. When we want to understand China defensive and strategic perspective, we have to understand not China as its immediate waters in front of its territory, coastal territory, but it's the first island chain. That's the real line of defense. Like the one for the US in the Pacific is given by already the second, to some extent, island chain, because it has allies like Japan, not to speak about minor points like Guam, Hawaii, and so on. But for China, it's the first island chain, the real line of defense. But as we can see, the first island chain includes Taiwan, a US ally, also South Korea, a US ally, and parts of Japan. And China wants to use this strategy within the seas of the first island chain, East China Sea and South China Sea. And as we can see, this creates a huge problems, because we have Taiwan in there, and we have clashing interests between the US and US allies and China. So if we want to just, in a nutshell, explain what is the core of China's strategy, is basically to assure that the costs of power projection would be unacceptable to an attacker, exactly like Tirpitz did vis-a-vis Great Britain. And so basically, China says, if I have a strong fleet in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, the US will never attack me. They cannot, because it would be too costly. It would represent also a problem, a domestic problem, an economic problem. Let's think of the economic interdependence between China and the US. And so basically we stay there to balance the situation. We balance the Pacific region. However, of course, and these are the conclusions, however, we have to understand that the US cannot accept this too much. Why? Because, for instance, if China continues to build up its navy, well, then we have what I would like to call a prestige dilemma for the US. Not only a security dilemma, a prestige dilemma, because otherwise, if the US doesn't do anything, doesn't intervene, clearly the allies of the US in the region will believe that the US is not interested in protecting them if China will attack eventually, especially Taiwan. And the US cannot afford this loss of prestige in that region. So at a certain point, it will have to stop China to somehow and to some extent. due to the principles of the Thucydides trap. We have to also understand when will be the point of non-return, when the US will have to stop China, or it will be too late. That's another interesting point. So basically, what we can say, and the conclusion is, what are the consequences of China's strategy? Will they augment the possibility of conflict or not? Or will they create a balance, so a stability and peace eventually? Or instead, will they create a war, a local conflict, especially if we consider Taiwan? Of course, the economic interdependence between US and China would suggest that the two countries won't fight a major war, and not even a local war probably, but this could change in the case of China intervention in Taiwan. In other words, it's not sure and it's not certain that economic interdependence can avoid the outbreak of war, because this was, for instance, the case in 1914. The UK and Germany had good economic relations, and then all of a sudden, World War I broke out. And okay, this is basically the conclusion. We can see some posters of World War I that were, of course, from the Entente against the Central Empires, against Germany specifically. Today, I don't know, maybe the US could use a similar propaganda against China. Who knows? Well, thank you very much for your attention. And I'm sorry if it was maybe too long, but okay, thank you. And thank you a lot again.
Thank you so much for sharing with us the results of your work. It provides room for a discussion and also for further research. For now, let's pass the floor to our discussant. Let's hear for his. Let's listen to his comments and maybe questions to our speaker.
Thank you, Paolo, for your report and this interesting article. The topic of geopolitical understanding of China's naval development and its analogy to naval development strategies in the past is very important for understanding China's military development in the present time and also the future geopolitical landscape. During your reports, I also would like to add some comments from the open source information. Now we observe what kind of result China naval force achieved through last 72 years of development. Now China has the biggest navy in the world. According to the data, China has about 330 navy ships and the United States has about 300. It's also expected that by 2025, 4 years later, the number will reach 400, and 9 years later, in 2030, it will reach 435. You mentioned in your article that Chinese military expenditure has increased by 75%, and I think it's very important to understand situation in the present time and also in the future. Also, I would like to mention that since the crisis in the Taiwan Strait, China's Navy show impressive results in different technological aspects. For example, thousands of short-range ballistics missiles and hundreds of medium-range ballistics missiles, which also changing geopolitical landscape in this region. The theory which you provide as a comparison between two strategic theories of 19th and 20th century is very important because all the facts and understanding of those facts can give us understanding what will happen in the future and how the balance of power could be changed in Asia Pacific, where China has different economic interests and also develop its offshore supply chain, where China carries out, as you know, most of the trade. So I would like, based on this, I would like to ask you a question and also ask audience for this question. You know that China developing and changing right now very fast, and China has been developing its navy through the years and have long term to develop. As I remember, there is a lot of information that what kind of results they will achieve in the next 29 years by 2050. Also, we can see now and in the last years that the frequency of various intensity cases has been increased, especially in Asia Pacific and the Southern Sea in this region. So I have a big question for you for discussion. How you think it will influence economic development of this region and probably geopolitical situation, not only in China, but also to other countries?
First of all, thank you so much, Igor, for your very interesting question, very multifaceted question. I'll try to answer as much as I can. Well, yes, clearly the data shows that China naval military buildup will continue. It will expand, and we'll have to understand actually if it will continue to adopt a regional strategy or if it will instead become a global, want to become a real global naval actor. It has interests now in several parts of the globe, and not only, of course, in the Pacific. Let's think also, for instance, in the Arctic. It's an increasing area where China is taking ground. However, I still believe that despite the numbers, we also have to consider technology. Of course, there is an increase in technological investments, clearly, especially, as I also said, in submarines and so on. But I still don't think, despite the numbers are impressive, but I still don't think that the aim of China is to replace globally the US as maritime hegemon. I don't think, because I still don't think that China has the same interest at stake that the US has in every part of the world. In the future, it may be possible there will be a shift. It may be well possible. And at that point, probably my article will be obsolete. But this is, of course, it's an article that is based on today, on these months. In the future, it will be possible. It will have a global projection, a more and more global projection. But, and this is where I think we have to understand, I don't think this will actually happen peacefully, through a peaceful transition. Because we have to understand, really, if the US and its allies will accept this. If the projections are, as you say, of a continuous military buildup, and a sophisticated technological investment, well, then this is really an arms race that could really lead to an arms race. And at that point, I think that there may be a breaking point in which the US and its allies would say, now we have to stop this thing. Otherwise, it will be too late. So I don't think that this transition will be peaceful if it will occur. I hope, of course, that a major conflict will never occur between these actors, of course. We always try and want peace in this world, but I don't think that the international community, or especially those actors that have interest in the Pacific, can accept a full-fledged hegemony of China. It's not in the interest of anyone, because despite what we think, China is also very isolated compared to other actors. It's not in the interest of, I think that nobody actually in the Pacific wants such a Chinese power in the region. Nor Russia, nor the United States, nor Japan, nor Indo-Chinese countries. And I will, as an empirical evidence, I will see that the treaty that has been concluded, the so-called AUKUS between Australia, UK, and US, now for the Pacific, the defense, this kind of defensive mechanism, is actually aimed at countering this Chinese build-up and this Chinese strength that it's creating in the Pacific. Well, let's see what will happen. Let's see. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have several questions and comments from the audience. Let's start with Alexey Kupriyanov. Please, we are glad to listen to your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Alexey Kupriyanov. I'm Senior Research Fellow at the International Institute of World Economy and International Relations of Russian Academy of Science. And I am working on the issue of Indian naval strategy. First of all, I'd like to thank the author for his extremely interesting article and speech, because it's always difficult to enter the murky waters of naval strategy, and you need audacity and courage to talk about Mehen and Tirpitz. But I would like to make a couple of criticisms, if I may. One will deal with issues of maritime strategy, and second, the broader issue of interaction between strategy and Chinese policy. First, I would like to remind that we do not have any consistent and integral text presenting the Tirpitz views. We can only reconstruct it based on some text, notes, memoranda, and let me remind you of its main provisions. First, Germany must create the navy of capital ships, strong enough to defeat the British Navy in the battle between Helgoland and the Thames, allowing the German army to land in Britain. Or to create the navy strong enough for Britain, even having won the victory over it, lost its dominant position in the seas and could have been defeated by the combined efforts of hostile Russia and France. Let's call the first part the landing idea, the second the risk theory. Well, Tirpitz proceeded with the following assumptions. First, that Britain, due to imperial obligations, would not be able to concentrate most of its navy against Germany. Second, due to its system of manning the navy, it will not be able to concentrate it quickly. And third, that the cost of ships will not grow. That is, the German budget will be able to cope with the creation of a big fleet. All three provisions were disavowed thanks to J.K. Fisher and Naval Revolution, because he convinced the king and government to reduce imperial obligations. He changed the manning system to nuclear crew manning, and he built the dreadnoughts, dragging Germany into devastating arms race that it could not endure. And moreover, in the beginning of the 20th century, the very foundation of risk theory was undermined because Japan destroyed the Russian fleet and Britain joined the Entente of Russia and France. And now Britain, even having lost a large part of the navy in the battle, did not risk losing its position of the hegemon, because Russia and France did not threaten it. Tirpitz ultimately hoped for the landing idea, that is, the Royal Navy would try to attack the German fleet or establish a close blockade, as it usually did. If it is defeated, Germany will be able to move troops across the North Sea and land them. But the British, instead, attacking of coast, established a long-range blockade, simply strangling Germany. And let's now compare the position and actions of Tirpitz with the position and actions of the Chinese strategists. Do we see something similar to the risk theory or landing theory? Absolutely not, because risk theory does not work against the United States, because there is no one who can challenge American hegemony on the seas, even if the power of the United States Navy is undermined by the battle with the Chinese fleet. The second idea of defeating the American fleet and crossing the Pacific Ocean with the aim of landing in the United States, too, as far as I can see, is absent in Chinese strategic thought. What is specifically Tirpitzian about Chinese naval thought and strategy? The author is absolutely correct in pointing out that the Chinese are developing A2AD technologies such as missile technologies, mines, submarines, and so on. But this is not a Tirpitzian strategy. The Tirpitzian strategy is built on idea of symmetrical navy development, not asymmetric. Tirpitz was not about the sea denial. What you are writing about in the article is more reminiscent of the strategy of Jules Nicole, a strategy not of Tirpitz but Phil Opp, where the main emphasis is on the use of small ships with asymmetric weapons, such as torpedoes, with which they are supposed to attack enemy capital ships trying to attack their ports. This is typical A2AD. I could also recall Wolfgang Wegener theory of strategic offensive in the context of Taiwan issue. In German naval thought, the typical A2AD navy was the navy of Leo von Caprivi, but not the navy of Tirpitz. There are many options for the strategy of the weak against the strong. You do not need to limit yourself to Tirpitz. And the second thing, I think that it's necessary to be careful when comparing the political ambitions of Germany during the Tirpitz era and today's China, because the German leadership was then torn between two main ambitions: the desire to protect their coast from the possible attack of Russian, French, and English ships on the one hand, and desire to enter the club of great powers on the other. In order to enter the club of great powers, a fleet was required. It was a state of thing. You were absolutely right. Critically necessary in order to be reckoned And this desire to have a huge fleet is completely Mechanian desire. What Tirpitz then proposed was a compromise to satisfy these two desires. This compromise had a rational basis in the form of the idea that the possession of powerful fleet would allow bargaining with the hegemon and seek concessions from him. But it's not Tirpitzian idea, because Anglo-French naval rivalry was built on this idea half a century before. It was a period of navalism, a very specific one, in which the possession of a large navy was a sign of great power. And this navy was both a deterrent and a means of waging local wars, providing the country with a place in the club of great powers. And now the situation is absolutely different, because the era of navalism, we think of the past, because the place of the navy is partly taken by aviation, partly by nuclear weapons. And China is not trying to find a compromise between Mechanianism and the need to protect its borders. It's only concerned with the problem of protecting its borders, the security of its trade interests, its distant assets, to which Tirpitz did not pay attention at all. Thinking about China through the lenses of Tirpitzian strategy, for me, means taking the easy route instead of trying to figure out what the Chinese really think about the future naval confrontation. And this is a mistake from my point of view. This is a mistake, and this mistake is made by many, for example, Murray, that you mentioned about, who takes it for granted that China wants to develop its navy in order to confirm its status of a great power. And this mistake is best avoided. I wish the author to avoid it in his future work. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alexei, for this very interesting insights, and also for this reconstruction, very interesting, of the different visions, naval visions, not only of Tirpitz, but also Caprivi and others. Well, of course, I see your point. Clearly, my suggestion, I'm not saying that it's the absolute truth, not at all. I'm just saying that it's a suggestion. And although I can admit, and I think I say this in the article, not all characteristics are Tirpitzian, I think that still there are some that, to some extent, make it not, I wouldn't say equal, but similar. There is some similarities, at least also in how China can be perceived as a revisionist, a latecomer. So also the fact that you said that it's using only asymmetric strategies, only A2AD capabilities. And I also say in the article that China is combining these also, for instance, with the aircraft carriers. And Igor was saying before that it has a very ambitious plan to actually increment, increase even more the fleet. And in this sense, it's not asymmetric. It's not asymmetric, and it's to some extent similar to Tirpitz, which increased every time this fleet to reach the same level, or at least try to reach the same level of Great Britain. In the article, I add a comparison of the number of ships that Great Britain and Germany had in this period, and we can see that actually it's not only asymmetric, and it's not only based on this kind of perception of only regional and non full-fledged competitiveness. China is doing exactly the same in this respect. But of course, I also understand that the things are different, especially the political discourse is different. I think that you're right when you say that Great Britain had allies at the time. It had Japan, it had, of course, France, it had also Russia, because the Entente was concluded, and so Germany was isolated. But this is also, I think, very similar to China, because China also is isolated, especially now that the US has concluded this agreement with Great Britain and Australia. There are some similarities, that's undoubtable, but I understand that the political discourse is different. Like at the time, Germany, Imperial Germany, was an aggressive, we can say, revisionist power. It was assertive. It really wanted, also in an aggressive dialectics and action, replace or at least defy Great Britain. Whereas China is, I think, much less assertive and aggressive. Although it wants to pursue its international power strategy and its global power strategy, it does that in a very calmer way, not with all that form of ideological let's say, assertiveness that was typical of Wilhelmine Germany. Thank you for your interesting comments.
Thank you so much. We have some other questions. Let's proceed to this Ksenia Murachina. Please ask the question.
Hello to everyone. Dear Paolo, nice to meet you. My name is Ksenia Murachina. I'm from Ural Federal University, a member of the Department of International Relations. Thank you very much for your presentation. You pointed out that China is focused on maritime power only in the Pacific region. I wanted to ask, how would you comment on China's activity in the rest of the regions? Or how would you comment on them regarding to theoretical issues, for example, in the Arctic, in the Antarctic as well? Although these activities are positioned as scientific, the expansion is obvious. For example, China is currently constructing its 5th station in the Antarctic, and it has had several expeditions. It has its own icebreaker fleet, and together with China's activity in Africa, its naval base in Africa, with China's in 2018 PLA ship visit to Venezuela, why don't you agree that China does pretend to global maritime presence? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ksenia. This is a very interesting question. Well, first of all, how do I interpret this? As I also said before, I'm not saying that China is only present in its sphere of privileged interest in the Pacific. I'm saying that that's probably where it's the major concentration of strategic military interests. As you also said, it's true that there is an increasing presence of China in the Arctic, in the Antarctica, in Africa, and so on. But also, at least formally, this presence is mainly due to economic reasons and commercial or some form of cooperational activities that don't necessarily require or imply the wish to become a military actor in those regions. Whereas in the Pacific region, it's a military actor of first category. In this sense, I may interpret the presence of China outside the Pacific and outside its seas as a tool to support and to carry out its economic interests, specifically in relation to the maritime silk strategy of the Belt and Road. So of course, it requires a backup from a military navy too, and also its interest in the Arctic region, especially now that I think that also China has an interest in the Arctic Council and so on. It's a support, I would say, the naval military of China to carry out its economic and infrastructural interests. But I still believe that the most important military area for China stays the Pacific. Thank you.
Now let's turn to Vasily Kashin, who has some remarks on the topic.
Yes, thank you very much, Paolo, for your very interesting presentation. I just wanted you to address more like the actual Chinese statements about their naval strategy, because it appears to me that there is some issue with this historical analogies, which are frequently being made, comparing Chinese naval expansion with German naval expansion prior to World War I. The style in many aspects is sometimes quite common, and the statements of the Chinese officials are sometimes quite common. Yet the development of the strategy, which started by Liu Huaxin and included gradual expansion of area of operations, is a kind of different. And first of all, we have officially two, but in reality, three different components in the Chinese naval strategy. Two of them are stated openly. So it's called now, it used to be called defense in the near seas, but after the recent revisions, it's defend in the near seas and protection in the far seas. So the Chinese Navy needs to be, from one point of view, to be prepared for the regional scenarios such as Taiwan, such as operations in South China Sea. But from the other hand, it needs to be present globally, since PLA lists protection of overseas interests as one of the top tasks. We see that actually what China is building is to a large extent a global navy, which is similar in structure to the US Navy, and in future will be built around several carrier battle groups. And Liu Huaxin, who was the creator and mastermind of this expansion, he explained his point of view that actually he understood that future of China would be depending on naval interests, naval sea routes, and naval resources. China was building itself as a major player of global economy. And what is even more important, China was losing completely any sources of threat on the continent, especially after the full normalization of the relations with the Soviet Union, and later the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Russia simply stopped to be a significant source of threat, and then India is too weak to be such a source of threat, and there is an easily defensible natural border. So there are these two components. So the regional scenarios are to a large extent really associated with the development of asymmetrical anti-access area denial capabilities, but the global scenarios are to a large extent associated with imitating the US Navy. But there is also a third major component, which the Chinese don't actually like to talk about, but that is component which didn't even exist in the period of early 20th century, and that is nuclear component. So now China is world power number 3 by number of nuclear ballistic missile submarines. They have at least 6 operational now. So it's more than France or UK. And from the Soviet experience, we know that a weaker naval power is dedicating huge has to dedicate huge resources to the protection of the SSBN. And even now, China is suspected of building so-called naval bastions in South China Sea, and possibly in future in other areas. And as we know from the experience of the Cold War, Soviet Union used to concentrate most of the resources of its naval capabilities to protection of these very bastions. And I think this is something which also needs to be taken into account. Do you actually consider the need to include it into your observations of the Chinese Navy? Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vasily, for your comment and intervention. It's very important what you highlighted. Well, yes, of course, we can also interpret China strategy as a global one, but my problem with this interpretation is that I don't think it can, at the state of the art, at the present condition, it cannot replace the United States. I mean, its fleet it's not only a problem of technology or number of ships, it's a problem of the structure of the international system. Because while the US has allies in all the parts of the world, and it has commitments to support those allies, China has not. China has investments, areas of economic interest, more and more infrastructural interests in Eurasia, in Africa, and sometimes in Latin America. But it does not have a system, a network of alliances that requires such a military overseas capacity that goes from Canada to Australia. In other words, if China wants one day really become a Mahanian power projector of global maritime power, the international system has to change. In other words, it should have a system that is similar to the one that the US created gradually after World War II. NATO, the system that it was the SEATO at the time of Indochina and so on, the Pacific also, the system of the alliance with Japan, Australia, some countries in the Middle East, Israel, all these things. But China does not have that. So in other words, I don't think that it needs now that kind of global exertion of maritime power simply because it does not have global allies that it has to protect. In the future, I don't know, this would be a major shift into power relations, into the system of the world, world balance of power and power shift, but this is something that we cannot foresee now. For the time being, China is still, I believe, a rather isolated country, although it's increasing its presence, clearly, especially economic presence, everywhere, more or less. But its military strategy, I think it's still aimed at controlling its immediate sphere of interest, and that's for sure. Its immediate sphere of interest are in the Pacific region. Then, of course, we can also understand, we have to understand that China, the literature on China has also focused so much this attention on revisionism. Like China is the par excellence, the revisionist country of today. And for instance, another work that has been published recently, and I also used it as a general frame, was a comparison of this China's military strategy and build-up, especially naval one, also in relation to, not as I did, Imperial Germany, but Imperial Japan before 1941. Very similar in scheme, but still it belongs to that revisionist strand of the literature that conceives China as a local, regional revisionist. It may have international, global interests, but are not military at the moment. I hope that I answered your question. Thank you.
We have 3 more questions, and I guess we still have time to answer them. So now let's turn to Artem Maltsev. Please ask your question.
Hello, good evening, everyone. First, thank you, Paolo, for your very interesting presentation. It was, for me, very insightful. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Artem Maltsev, and I am a doctoral student of political science at HSE University Moscow. So, and I'd like to add up to already very comprehensive comments from Vasily Borisovich and Alexey Vladimirovich. And I also have a short comment and a question connected to this comment. So when we're talking about Chinese strategies of naval buildup, I think we have to take into account the incredibly secretive nature of Chinese military doctrinal theory, and thus very limited scope of empirical sources on it. So practically we don't have any available open source Chinese strategy of naval development. We don't know any primary information on it, and we can only judge based on secondary sources such as different reports made by state-affiliated analysts who may or may not represent the actual picture, the actual plans that are being discussed somewhere in between Chinese political and military leadership. This is point one. Point two, when we're talking about the concept of anti-access area denial, A2AD, I think we have to take into account that in the latest security studies literature, there is a growing criticism towards the entire concept and, some sort of proliferation of such concepts beyond basically academic language and academic literature. So what I'm talking about is that A2AD concept was basically developed by United States Department of Defense analysts around 20 years ago in the beginning of 2000s. And this concept represents a very United States-centric way of assessing adversaries' capabilities. Basically, the United States being expeditionary power, power that need to project its military force across the oceans, looks at its potential enemies and their technical capacity, technical capabilities, using its own doctrinal lenses of force projection. Basically, United States Department of Defense analysts see at United States capabilities, tactical aviation, aircraft carriers, and et cetera, and they see what capabilities Chinese People Liberation Army Navy has to stop United States intervention to the specific theaters of Southeast China Sea or Taiwan or etc. But what actually United States analysts think about Chinese naval buildup may not actually represent what the Chinese analysts actually think about it. And we see an example in Russia-NATO military discourse, where basically the concept of A2AD was applied to multiple Russian military systems, such as air defense systems, such as, anti-ship missiles, or etc. Just to say that Russian military strategy is to, for example, deny NATO forces airports, bases, in the Baltic states, and thus prevent NATO intervention in a potential conflict somewhere in the Eastern Europe. But basically, the studies of Russian operational languages suggest completely no A2AD strategy at all. And basically, Russian equivalent of A2AD concept in Russian, зона воспрещения доступа и маневра. This is actually a direct translation of the United States analysts' language on the subject. So basically, Russian analysts took United States concept and tried to use it because the concept itself became a buzzword. And we completely do not see any A2AD strategy inside Russian strategic military sources, strategic documents that describe Russian way of war and Russian way of strategic thinking. So my question to you, don't you think that while trying to describe Chinese strategy as A2AD strategy as some sort of asymmetric approach of not letting the United States to intervene in possible conflicts in Taiwan or at Southeast China Sea, we're actually trying to not understand what Chinese think on the subject, but what United States defense analysts think on the subject. And a very short final point, the buildup of Chinese Navy happened across very short period of time. If we look at Chinese Navy somewhere around 20 years ago, if you look on its force structures, on the technology that it's used, we see that basically in the beginning of 2000s, Chinese Navy was basically a green water Navy. So in many ways, it was very comparable to contemporary Iran's Navy, to contemporary Navy of other so-called rogue states. But now, since after around 20 years, basically the technology has developed so rapidly that possibly the strategic thinking behind it, the doctrinal thinking behind such modernization may not actually represent the current state of capabilities that Chinese actually operate. So there might be a gap between the strategies and ideas that were developed in 2000s and what we're actually having now due to rapidly developing nature of Chinese Navy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Artyom, for your very, very interesting observations and questions. Well, first of all, I would like to, yes, address your first comment and concern. It's true. It's very true. We analyzed this Chinese military buildup, naval military buildup, essentially through secondary literature that belongs to Western academia. That's very true. We don't have the real insight and the real point of view that comes from the Chinese officials, and even to some extent from Chinese scholars. Well, first of all, that's one of my limits because I don't speak Chinese, so I cannot have access to those sources. But I also think that those sources are quite difficult to get, especially the official ones. I think they're classified. So, in other words, it's true. Maybe there is this entire debate and discussion around China naval buildup is biased because it takes into account the US perspective. And so, as you say, maybe it's the US that is trying to see that as a risk detent strategy, and we have been indirectly affected by this view. And this doesn't correspond at all to the Chinese point of view. However, we can also say that, as far as I know, there have been some Chinese scholars that are familiar with also let's call it the Western debate, that also, however, follow some conclusions that can be acceptable. When I introduced my literature review section, you can see that I have highlighted different interpretations of this naval buildup. But I think that also at least some of that literature relies on also what has been discussed in Chinese internal debate. I remember specifically that I used a source that referred to an analysis of the discussion between Chinese naval officers, and there is, if I'm not mistaken, a strand of them that has a more, let's call it, assertive and aggressive view on the topic, one that has a more defensive view on the topic. This refers exactly to the Chinese internal debate. I don't remember exactly the source, but it's valuable. Actually, it was a suggestion of one of the reviewers, and it's in English, so it's accessible to all. I read it and it was very interesting. So maybe I will then send it to you when I find it out. And so this is a very good point. And regarding the second point, which is the evolution of the Chinese fleet in a very short time span, this is absolutely true. Well, of course, we can consider China as a great power, as I also said in the paper, only from like for full-fledged global power, only starting from the earlier 2000s. And it's incredible the way in which China developed also militarily in 20 years. We may remember that during, for instance, the 1999, if I'm not mistaken, the 1999 crisis in what was left of Yugoslavia, it was Serbia, when Serbia was bombed in 1999, Belgrade was bombed in 1999 due to the Kosovo crisis by the US and the NATO coalition. I remember that the US destroyed, probably accidentally, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And at the time, China didn't answer very assertively because China didn't have the power, nor the diplomatic power, nor the military power to have a reaction to that and respond and retaliate. It would be inconceivable today, a similar behavior from the US or anyone, to attack so frontally and, let's say, abruptly China. This to explain how in 20 years, things have changed enormously for China. And in this respect, I also say that I find an analogy exactly with Imperial Germany, because also the Hochseeflotte, as it was called, the High Sea Fleet of Germany, was created in a very, very short time span due to technological improvements, due to the industry of the United Germany, and the same things, due to technological investment of China. China could create and can create now this tremendous fleet, which of course now it has to we have to take into account, compared to Germany at the time, the nuclear aspect. So thank you very much for this interesting comments.
I guess we are running out of time, but there are still a lot of questions. Maybe Paola will have an opportunity to answer them via email. But I guess we have time for one question from Alexander Asafov. Please ask the question.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm pleased to meet our speaker, Mr. Paolo. So I'm from High School of Economics, and my point of interest is Japanese Navy, actually. So I have a few questions of a more practical entity, if you don't mind. Namely, the arms race between China and Japan, as Japanese military is my area of professional interest. Japan is now increasingly lagging behind in number of major classes of warships, and is trying to secure technological superiority over China. So Japan has formed as Suriki Kidodan, a rapid deployment amphibious brigade, and plans to form at least one more unit as relations with China escalate. All of this is being done as part of a continuous projection exercise concept. In this way, Japan plans to deal with the threat posed by China in the event of a possible Chinese landing on the disputed Senkaku Island. So does China have similar units and ways to ensure a rapid landing to counterpart Japan in this field? And moreover, does China possess a similar to CPEC theory to ensure the landing? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. I must admit that this question is very, very technical. Now, I'm not exactly an expert of the precise different kind of units that China has. I have a general knowledge of that, but I can answer you in a broader way, answering your question about Chinese-Japanese rivalry and naval rivalry in the Pacific. Well, that is clearly, in my opinion, the result of a security dilemma. It's obvious that if China is increasing so much its fleet, this will have as a natural consequence, due to mistrust, as a natural consequence, the equivalent build-up of Japan. But not only of Japan, also other actors that are backed by the US and that have interest to contain China and to avoid a power transition or a shift of a balance of power in that region. The exact way in which this will affect the dispute, for instance, in the Senkaku Islands or other scenarios in that region, we still don't know, but we can say that China is at the moment, I believe, the weakest link in this rivalry, because any intervention of China any direct intervention of China to modify the status quo of the Senkaku disputed islands, or the Spratly or others, or of course Taiwan, not to speak about Taiwan, will inevitably create the preconditions to consider China not only a revisionist power, but also an aggressive revisionist power that would then justify coercive action against it from both the US and its allies. And actually, it's interesting to note that some say that this is also a strategy to force China to intervene somewhere in those crises, in those conflicts, to create the precondition, the so-called casus belli, to actually ignite a major conflict. Well, we'll see if this will happen. We hope not, of course, but the situation is very delicate. And actually, I think that in the future, it will escalate a bit, or maybe significantly. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Thank you so much. Maybe we may answer one more question.
I've seen that there was a question from Andrei, from Professor Prekovic. Maybe we can
I also
Okay.
see that we have a Chinese colleague here, Yuli-Wan. Maybe
I'll cede my
question.
let the Chinese colleague. It would be interesting.
Please,
Some balance, you know.
please.
I guess he's here.
Please.
Can you ask a question? I guess Yaliva doesn't hear us.
I'm here. Sorry.
Okay.
I forgot to turn on my microphone. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I want to make an introduction of myself. I'm from China and I graduated from Peking University. Now I'm a master's student in HSE. And I basically really agree with some of your points in the presentation that China is basically now a regional force and it's seeking regional interests. And at this stage, it is not seeking for global expansion or global interests. I think this is a very thoughtful and insightful observation. And I have a very small question. And I noticed a small detail in the presentation about the first island chains and the second island chains. And you use this conception to, you're trying to say that this is a part of China's plan and China is, it's kind of like China's future plan on China's footprint, like China is now seeking its interest in the first island chain, including Taiwan. And in the future, maybe China is going to seek more interest in the second island chain. And I think it's very interesting because from China's perspective, we're using the conception of island chains from in a very different way. Like we're thinking that the island chains is a conception that is invented by the US from the very beginning in order to contain China. So actually China is using this term to express our fear of strategic encirclement by US. That is to say, we think China is actually the target of the island chain theories instead of the country that is trying to using the island chain theories as a tool. And in recent times, in the West, like Western scholars and Western media is trying to say that China is actually using this conception as a tool instead of being conceptualized as a target by this conception. So I want to ask that, is it proper to use this conception trying to say that China is seeking more interest in the first island chain and second island chain? And that is my question.
Thank you so much, Yali. This was really, really a good question, a very interesting one. Actually, thank you, because yes, it's very important to see the island chains from the Chinese perspective, not only from the US one, because of course, as you say, usually we think that these island chains are used by the US to create this strategy of containment, as an idea of containment of China. First, we contain it in the second island chain, and we think at least we have to contain it in the first one. But if we consider the opposite view, and from the Chinese perspective, it's quite the opposite. China is not in any way an expansionist force, but it's actually an encircled force that has to some extent, survive and breathe from this encirclement that comes from South Korea through to the Philippines, passing from Japan and Taiwan, etc. So, of course, it's another completely different point of view, but it's very valid, and it's clearly represents that state of things according to which it's not absolutely true that China is expanding its influence, but actually is trying to avoid this encirclement and this kind of asphyxiating strategy by the US and its allies. what I tried to say also in the presentation is that the first island chain, it's the most important for China because it's the, let's say, the condition, the minimal condition in order to breathe and exert its national interest in waters of course, national interest and influence. The second island chain would be probably also maybe, of course, it has interest even there, but that could be probably sacrificed. The first island chain, no. And the fact that Taiwan is within that first island chain creates probably the major difficulties for the stabilization of the region and for the security and peace of the Pacific, of that area of the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are sorry if we didn't have an opportunity to answer all the questions. Today's discussion was really great. Paolo, thank you so much. Your presentation stimulated a really great discussion. And I also would like to invite all the participants to join the other presentation on the 18th of November on the Paolo's book on Eurasianism, an ideology for the multipolar world. Please follow our website for news and register. We will be glad to have the same great discussion with thought-provoking comments. See you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.